Be seated, please. Well, some of us were raised on the old Book of Common Prayer. And those of us who were raised on the Book of Common Prayer, that's the old Anglican prayer book, will recall that at the start of every Eucharist in prayer book days, over on the bottom of page 69, so right at the start of the Eucharist service, was the summary of the law. And so we always heard, week after week, this, the summary of the law. And I think it's one of those texts that we can therefore take for granted. And when we take a text like that for granted, we forget some of the impact of the text in its day. And so this text, this teaching of Jesus, in the context, in his day, was tremendously subversive. And I will get to how it is that it's subversive and then what this might have to do with us on a week when we celebrate All Saints and All Souls and our day-to-day lives. So keep in mind the general sort of approach to understanding of the universe that was common in that time was that if bad things happen to you, you're therefore a sinner and God is punishing you, right? Simple little math. And we see those stories repeatedly in the New Testament. You remember last week was Bartimaeus. Back in chapter 8, that section starts with another healing of a blind man. And constantly the question is, when someone's blind or bad things happen, well, who sinned? This guy or his parents? It's one or the other. Simple sort of math as their approach, a balance sheet approach to life and bad things and good things happening to you too, right? Good things were happening to you. Well, you must just be Mr. or Ms. Wonderful. God is clearly smiling on you. So you're therefore obviously sinless too. So that was the approach. The problem they had was their nation has now been suffering occupation for a significant period of time. First, they still remembered the Babylonian captivity. And then after, there was the Restoration, and then Alexander the Great comes along, and they're occupied, taken over by the Greeks. And then on the heels of the Greeks, it's the Romans. And so, why are they occupied? Well, obviously they sinned as a nation. And so there's this movement afoot for strict adherence to the law of Moses. All 683, depending on how you count 683 or 686, all 683 little dictums and, nitpicky details of the law of Moses. And if we could just get everybody to follow the law of Moses, like what we Pharisees do in all of our self-righteousness and purity and superiority, then that would drive the Romans out. So simple sort of approach to understanding the world and understanding bad things and why bad things happen. Now, over time, you can see how what started to develop with that understanding was very much a us versus them sort of approach to people's lives. Us being the pure, the holy, the high and mighty, the mucky-mucks, who never sin, who follow all the laws, and all of those awful, horrible people who are doing all the wrong things and don't seem to care about the law. And what happened with that system is they completely ignored any of the teachings of the prophets, for instance, about taking care of the widow and orphan. They ignored any of those issues around leaving the gleanings in your fields for the poor, or the year of Jubilee where all debt is set free and properties are returned to original owners. They ignored all of those ones because, those would have benefited all of those sinners, right? And ignoring them happened to benefit another group of people. And so that's sort of the backdrop. Another part of this text is this is delivered. Jesus is in the temple. He's just had several disputes with the Pharisees. This is in the last week of his life. And it was only, given that week, it was only a couple of days before this that he had gone in and overturned the tables in the temple. And you remember why he did that, right? Said, "You've turned my father's house into a den of thieves." I'll jog your memory on why he did that, is because it had become a control racket. And what I mean by a control racket is with this approach and understanding of the world, then there was a whole sort of balance sheet. So that if you committed this sin, or that sin, well, you had to sacrifice 2 turtle doves or maybe a couple of pigeons, or if it was bigger ones, then maybe a goat or maybe a heifer. I love how Paul just critiques that system where he says about what, you think the blood of bulls and the ashes of a heifer is going to do any good? He critiques that system. But your sacrifice had to be blemish-free, so it had to be inspected. The people who inspected were on the payroll of the temple. And don't worry if it's not blemish-free, because for your convenience and to serve you better and make a one-stop shopping experience, what they did was they had pre-inspected, guaranteed blemish-free sacrificial animals available for a premium price, of course, because they are inspected and guaranteed after all. But you couldn't use your street money. You had to exchange and use temple money. But again, don't you worry, you don't have to go out into the city to one of the local banks to do that. They also happen to have a money exchanging stall right there to change your secular money into temple money for a small premium, because there are, user fees and processing fees and all that sort of thing. So it's a whole racket, right? So when Jesus speaks these words, I picture him, and given this is a couple of days later, they probably put the tables back up and the doves and pigeons and goats and heifers, they're all there. I picture him standing in front of all of those tables. And he is saying of that entire sacrificial system, you don't need any of this. What are the 2 top priorities? Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And those 2 commandments, I think they are immensely healthy and helpful for us. Because love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. That's about keeping us rooted and grounded in reality. It's about keeping us rooted in a recognition of what are the important things in life and what are all the things, the false idols and gods that we can be so duped into chasing after that are not going to do us any good anyway. So being rooted in the important things, the right things, versus, well, I've got to chase after enlarging my bank account balance, or I need a new, I got to drive a Lamborghini instead of that terrible Porsche, or, chasing after all the wrong things. It keeps us rooted and grounded in the important things. And the second greatest law that Jesus speaks is about balance. Love your neighbor as yourself. And when I say that is about balance, that one is about not putting ourselves down in inordinate ways and beating ourselves up and low self-esteem and all of that sort of thing, and building other people way up and thinking, I'm a worm and less than nothing and other people are just spectacular. No, it's about balance. Love yourself too. Honor yourself too. Be compassionate to yourself too. It's about balance. And so when I say what is the connection between these 2 teachings of Jesus and all saints is you think about what we have done traditionally in the church with the idea of saint. And what we have done with the idea of saint is put the saints up on some sort of pedestal place that we think none of us could ever possibly attain that grand status as a saint. That's not what the idea of saint was supposed to be about initially. And you can look at the lives of several of the saints and think about their early lives, and there's not a lot there there's a lot of scandal in the early lives of some of the saints. Think of Augustine or some of his writings, or Francis for that matter, too. It's not that they were that much better than us. It's that they were able, after their conversion experiences, they were able to keep this balance of loving God and loving their neighbor as themselves, applying that, living that out in the world. There's a wonderful quotation by Evelyn Underhill. I wrote it down because at the 8 o'clock I tried to use my phone and First time I've ever tried to use a phone to pull up a quotation, and it didn't work. So I like paper and pencil. So Evelyn Underhill, she says, the real saint is neither a special creation nor a spiritual freak. They do not stand aside, wrapped in delightful prayers and feeling pure and agreeable to God. They go right down into the mess. And there, right down in the mess, they're able to radiate God because they possess God. And that, above all else, is the priestly work that wins and heals souls. Now, some people may think, well, you can't force love. Either you love God or you don't love God. You can't force love. But, in the Renaissance era, there was a great saying, it makes more sense in Italian, but the idea to this saying out of the Renaissance era is even if you feel there's a virtue that you don't have, practice it anyway. Live as if you do anyway. So if you don't think that you love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, act as if you do anyway. And when I say act as if you do, I'm not talking about being pretentious. It's not that. It's do the right things anyway. Whether your heart is in them or not, do the right things anyway. And that what happens is over time, you may just find that has become a more natural response to you anyway. So that you engage in the traditional Christian practices and virtues, whether your heart's in it or not. Doesn't really matter. And what might happen to you, however, is your heart will grow into it. And so that, it seems to me, is how we address love God, love one another, love your neighbor as yourself. It's about rooted groundedness and balance. And I think, like Evelyn Underhill, that is indeed how we change lives and how we change the world. Amen.